Welcome to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. In this third episode, I will be introducing to the world one of the most charming and culturally significant cafes in Japan. Those of you enjoying, or hopefully enjoying, this on YouTube may have noticed that I'm recording from a different location today. I usually record this in the basement of my flat in Tokyo, but today I am in a town called Atami. For those of you who don't know, and statistically speaking, most of you probably don't, Atami is a small seaside resort city on the Izu Peninsula, roughly 100 kilometers from Tokyo, or about 40 minutes by Shinkansen, the bullet train, the world's first true high-speed railway service. It is famous for hot springs, a frankly alarming quantity of ryokan inns, and the particular kind of melancholy you only get in places that were once glamorous and are now mostly visited by people wondering if they've made the right life choices. The Japanese counterpart of Blackpool or Long Island, if you like. In other words, it's my kind of town. I was born here. I even wrote a love song for this town called Atami My Miami under the pseudonym Nivatak, available on every self-respecting streaming platform. And that's the end of shameless plug. My mother was a geisha here. She only retired during COVID. I'll cover the subject of, not COVID, but geisha properly if enough of you are interested. But I digress. The cafe in question is in this town. Tucked down a side alley off the Ginza-dori shopping arcade. Yes, Atami, like myriad of Japanese cities, has its own Ginza, considerably more compact than the renowned Boulevard of the same name in the capital. There is a cafe, or as locals say, Junkissa, that carries the opulence and charm of a bygone era. It is called Bonnet. Bonnet is, I would argue, one of the most extraordinary cafes in Japan. A place where time stopped sometime around 1960 and apparently couldn't be bothered to start again. Which, frankly, is a quality I deeply respect in cafe. Café Bonnet opened in 1952. The owner, the master, as cafe proprietors are called in Japan, is a gentleman named Hiroshi Masuda. Born in Katsushika, Tokyo in 1929, the same birthplace and roughly same birth year as Tora-san, the beloved fictional character at the center of what is allegedly one of Iggy Pop's favorite film franchise and the holder of a Guinness World Record. But that too is a topic for another time. Masuda-san had served as a reserved soldier or pilot in the Special Attack Unit, also known as the Kamikaze, during the war. Fortunately, Hirohito decided to call it a day before Masuda-san flew a one-way mission to Okinawa in his Zero fighter. History rarely does this, but on this occasion chose wisely. After the war, Masuda-san worked at an officers' club in Ginza, this time the Ginza, the one in Tokyo, for the American occupation force, and it was there that he learned English. Yes, he speaks fluent English, and developed his love for American music, especially jazz, and most importantly, encountered something that would change his life, the culinary landscape of a small resort town on the East Coast, and eventually the whole of Japan. A hamburger. Now, hold that image in your mind for a moment. Japan, 1946, or thereabouts. The country is in ruins. The emperor has just informed the nation by radio that the war situation has developed not necessarily in Japan's favor, which in terms of understatement ranks alongside the Titanic has encountered some buoyancy issues. And into this context walks young Masuda-san, staring at a bread bun containing a beef pate, presumably trying to work out which end to start from. Masuda-san immediately took a fancy to it. However, he felt that the American-style burger was too big. Well, frankly, what else is new? and too heavily spiced for Japanese palate at the time. So he developed his own version, a lighter, Japanese-inflected recipe with a sweet savory sauce that resembles teriyaki. He thought if he adopted this for Japanese taste, it would be explosively popular. And time proved him right. When Café Bonnet first opened, customers had never seen anything like it. People would stare at the thing and sincerely ask Masuda-san how to approach it. He was, in effect, running a one-man hamburger orientation program in a resort town that still hadn't quite decided what century it wanted to be in. I would love to declare that Bonnet serves the oldest surviving hamburger in Japan. Alas, it is the second oldest. The title of the oldest hamburger in Japan goes to a place in the northern city of Sendai called Hosoya no Sando, founded in 1950 and still in operation, a mere 2 years before Masuda-san opened Bonnet. A footnote: the oldest hamburger establishment in Japan I could find any record of opened 2 years before Hosoya no Sando and 4 years before Bonnet, so that would be 1948, in Roppongi. It closed around the year 2000. McDonald's, for context, would not arrive in Japan until 1971, nearly 2 decades after Masuda-san began selling hamburgers in Atami. In fact, that's actually a year before the McDonald's brothers came up with the now famous Golden Arch design and began franchising and eventually driving local eateries around the world out of business. This hamburger is not even half the story, because what made Bonnet genuinely extraordinary wasn't just the food, it was the clientele. Before opening his cafe, Masuda-san had worked at NHK and moved in cultural circles in Ginza, which was back then the center of culture, art and literature in Tokyo, or possibly in Japan. Anyhow, he brought those connections with him to Atami, which was fortunate because Atami in the 1950s and 60s was precisely the kind of place where Japan's creative class kept villas and came to think, write, drink, of course, and generally behave in ways they preferred not to do in Tokyo. By the by, Atami was also renowned for dirty weekends. The list of Bonnet's stellar regulars reads like a syllabus for a very good university course nobody actually offers. Junichiro Tanizaki, Naoya Shiga, Toshiro Mifune, Akihiro Miwa, Fubuki Koshiji, Tony Tani. And Tanizaki, who had a villa nearby, was particularly devoted. Masuda-san described him as looking like a retired old man on the outside, but being completely modern on the inside. Tanizaki once asked Masuda-san to broker an introduction between himself and the celebrated film critic Nagaharu Yodogawa, who was also a regular, which suggests that Bonnet functioned as much as a social switchboard as a cafe. The list of celebrities who used to hang out at Bonnet continues. However, the most fascinating one would have to be one Yukio Mishima. Well, where does one even begin? Alongside Haruki Murakami, Mishima is Japan's most internationally celebrated novelist. 3 Nobel Prize nominations, a body of work of terrifying beauty and discipline, and also a man who, in November 1970, concluded his life by attempting to incite a military coup and then committing ritual seppuku. How charming. But in the 50s and the 60s, young Mishima was simply the most celebrated writer in Japan, with a sideline of bodybuilding, kendo, acting, and a general performance of masculinity. Well, speaking of acting, in 1960, he starred in a film ironically named Afraid to Die, And this movie, admittedly, is a cheap Yakuza B-movie, which I think Mishima had a particular fondness of. Yeah, he had a very twisted aesthetics, I think. So he would have preferred to be in this kind of movie on the verge of being really trashy, rather than just like high art, like Ozu's films, for example. So the film's called Afraid to Die. I recommend it with a slight reservation, so long as you've got a very twisted sense of humor. I mean, admittedly, Mishima is not exactly the greatest actor in the solar system. But I thought it was fun. But then I have a very twisted sense of humor. So if you think you've got a very, 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 very twisted sense of humor, then watch it. It's quite funny. Anyhow, Mishima used to stay at the Atami Hotel, a legendary Western-style establishment a short distance from the city center. It doesn't exist anymore, but Atami Hotel was very, very famous back then. So Mishima used to come to Atami every July and August and stayed at Atami Hotel and wrote. And it was there at the hotel swimming pool that he first encountered Masuda-san. Masuda-san noticed Mishima on the poolside, famously sculpted physique on full display, however, conspicuously not swimming. So Masuda-san went over to Mishima and asked why. To which the great macho man of letters coyly replied, "I can't swim." "What?" exclaimed Masuda-san. "With that physique?" Masuda-san, a former member of his university swimming club, proceeded to offer Japan's greatest literary genius swimming lessons, which is, by any measure, an absolutely extraordinary sentence to be able to say about one's life. They had more in common than you might expect. Mishima was 4 years older, but they were roughly of the same generation, survivors of the same war, interestingly, and navigating the same strange New Japan. They shared a love of cinema, of jazz, of the particular intellectual restlessness of men trying to build something interesting out of the rubble. Mishima, who loved anything modern, Western, and slightly transgressive and kitsch, took to Bonnet immediately. An American intellectual mate of mine, a devoted reader of Japanese literature, visited Bonnet about 3 years ago and asked Masuda-san in the course of conversation what Mishima's favorite had been. Masuda-san told him, in perfect English, it was the Hamburger. Masuda-san and Mishima's friendship had a fascinating dynamic. Masuda-san was actually the talker, and Mishima, interestingly, was not, which, having watched several of his interview reels, is rather hard to believe, but Masuda-san could draw him out. They talked about films, about jazz, about Atami, about whatever Mishima happened to be thinking about at any given moment, which was usually either classical Japanese aesthetics or how to look better with his shirt off. The back booth where Mishima used to sit is still there, and I've sat in it several times and had beer. However, being a veggie sort, I cannot savor the legendary hamburger that Japan's greatest literary genius loved so much. The name Bonnet, incidentally, comes from a film called Easter Parade, an American musical in which large numbers of women appear in traditional European bonnets. So it's not what the Americans would call a hood. In fact, bonnet is, in origin, a French word absorbed into English, carried to Japan by an American film repurposed as the name of a cafe that became famous for hamburgers introduced by the US military, which is basically the entire post-war cultural history of Japan in a single word. Masuda-san also wanted to create a place where women felt genuinely welcome. And the strategy worked. The cafe's earliest patronage chiefly came from local geishas, including my mother, who has been a customer since 1954. The writers followed, then the actors, then the film critics, and Toshiro Mifune requesting with his signature deep voice a coffee. Well, actually, it was more likely beer. I would love to say with full confidence that you owe it to yourself to visit Café Bonnet in Atami if you're ever in Japan. But I can't. The last time I visited Bonnet was in February, roughly 2 months before I recorded this episode, and it was around that time that I sort of began conceiving the idea of this episode. Masuda-san, aged 97, was there, looking very healthy and happy and cheerful, chatting with another regular customer. He was telling her he was still physically and mentally sharp, that his hearing was still excellent. He actually had been a member of a local jazz band, and then added, with a big grin, "I'm 97. What's wrong with me?" About a month after that visit, I heard from someone that Masuda-san had suddenly passed away, and Bonnet has been closed ever since. It's been about 3 weeks now, and the fate of the legendary cafe remains unknown. Masuda-san ran his cafe quite literally until the last weeks of his life, or until the last breath. I can still see him clearly, behind the counter with the unhurried authority of a man who had watched Japan go from wartime rationing to TikTok, and who had quietly, stubbornly refused for 7 decades to let his cafe become anything other than exactly what he had decided it would be. What a spirit, what a man. So, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely fascinating or even mildly diverting, do consider liking and subscribing. And I insist that Atami is still very much worth visiting, with or without Bonnet. So until next time, I'm Ken Nishikawa. And Masuda-san, rest in peace.